Hello, everybody. This is Chris Reeder. I'm a partner with Husch Blackwell's Energy and Natural Resources Group, and welcome everybody to the 7th installment of our joint webinar series brought to you by Husch Blackwell and the Texas Renewable Energy Industries Alliance. This hour we're going to cover the formation of the new E-Mobility Working Committee, which will address policy and regulatory issues regarding electric mobility in the state of Texas. And we're also going to review issues associated with expanded deployment of electric-powered vehicles, such as appropriate regulatory provisions and technology deployment. Before we begin, I'm going to cover just a few housekeeping items that will be a benefit as you listen to the presentation. At the bottom of your audience console, we have multiple application icons that you can use during the program. The first of these are, if you have any questions during the webcast, we hope that you'll submit those through the question box. We'll try to answer all the questions during the webinar today, but if we run out of time or if there's a more involved answer that's necessary, we'll try to answer those through email. For those of you who've attended, you know that audience participation is a very important part of our webinars. We really encourage it, think that it makes for a much more robust and informative hour, and hope that you will feel free to submit any and all questions that you have about our presentation today. Okay, if you have any technical difficulties, why don't you click on the help icon, which is a question mark and provides information about common technical issues. A copy of our slide deck for today will be available in the resource list icon, and that looks like a folder at the bottom of the screen. We've been approved for Texas continuing legal education credit. So if you're an attorney and you want to report your hour in Texas, you can click on the CLE widget, which is also at the bottom of your screen, and you can complete those questions. You'll just need your bar number to submit. And finally, we'll have a recording of the webinar, and that will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. We will email a link of this recording to everyone who's on our presentation today, as well as the certificate of attendance. And we'll put a podcast version of the program on the Husch Blackwell website. We also put a link to the webinar on the TREIA website as well, so that'll be available there also. Okay, that's enough of the technicalities. So let's now turn to the presentation. And our presenter today is Michael Lumley. And Michael's a founding partner and chief operating officer at Alternative Resource Group, which is one of 2018's top 10 microgrid service companies, according to Energy CIO Insights magazine. Michael has 15 years of experience in the energy sector, working in microgrids, EV infrastructure, and utility-scale solar development. He's dedicated to ensuring that energy infrastructure development is accomplished in a modular and sustainable fashion, and his team at ARG is bringing comprehensive solutions for driving EV charging infrastructure deployment and bringing utility-scale solar and energy storage projects to fruition. Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the introduction. And welcome everybody in the audience. Really glad you joined us for today's discussion. So what we are here for, just to touch on what Chris pointed out, the Texas Renewable Energy Industries Alliance has started the E-Mobility Working Committee to bring together the stakeholders, both here in the state and nationally, that are interested in being a part of building the sector in an intelligent way that allows for project development and the business opportunities associated with this new transition and evolution of technology. So we welcome people's input and feedback, and at the end of the presentation, we will share some information for people who are interested in becoming part of the working committee. I was brought in through through the board members at TREIA due to our recent experience in the sector from the projects that we are developing. But our focus internally with our group is in the California market, and what we've seen in the California market as it develops has been very educational as to best practices that can be implemented to help really foster a productive environment, and then a few lessons learned, things that were probably less constructive. So that's our goal, is to take the good, leave the bad, and really build a strong sector for the state of Texas. So let's kick off the presentation from there. Obviously, we've touched a little bit on this. I do have to apologize. That is a picture of me, and that is actually what I look like. So that is our role, going back into talking through what the purpose of the committee is. And this is really just to demonstrate what we've been seeing in the market as far as growth, just strictly from the passenger vehicle adoption. As you can see, this is the kind of thing that lots of analysts and investors like to see. The up and to the right has been consistent. What I would say is the growth, though as you can see, it's very linear. There have been some considerable jumps, and there are some developments that are coming in the near term that I think are really going to magnify some of these trends. But we'll touch on that later. One thing to note from this slide, because anytime you're talking about electric mobility in the United States, there is one very relevant point, which is California represents 50% of the electric vehicle ownership in the United States. So it's a profound leap forward when you go into the California market. But that also creates quite the interesting microcosm for how the market develops and what utilities specifically, their ability to cope with this sort of penetration looks like. And what I would say is, I think we are very lucky. The state of Texas is one of the top 5 strongest markets in the nation. And what this does is we can look at what has the experiences that they have had in the California market and really take advantage of the fact that we have the runway now to be able to set market rules, create, market structure, look at policy and look at legislation, and set ourselves up for a much easier success, just because by the very nature of the fact that we do have some lead time that I think they had to solve all their problems. It's sort of like building the car as it's driving down the road. So touching on this also brings us into what has been one of the biggest drivers for the market. And going back to my background for just one moment, I was formerly the Texas Utility Scale Development Manager for Solar City. It was obviously one of the brainchildren of Elon Musk and a subsidiary. Essentially, Elon was the chairman of Solar City at that point. But we were directly connected to the Tesla stationary storage group in looking at including stationary storage on our utility scale projects in the state of Texas, supporting municipally owned utilities and electric co-ops in the state. So it is that connection that led me into the EV charging infrastructure work that we are doing now, because obviously that storage technology, what few people know outside of that family tree is that Elon Musk actually started Tesla not to become a gigantic, wonderful car company, although I would say the numbers on the screen obviously demonstrate that he has had some good success in that. But his goal was actually to become the largest utility in the world using batteries as a resource to support distributed energy resources and allowed to provide electrical service around the globe. I'd say one of the big demonstrations of that is going to be the battery farm that he took into Australia after their blackout incidents 2 years ago. And really what had happened was the scaling the production of the cars allowed to scale the production of the batteries themselves. So it's an interesting underlying backstory. But what I think is really remarkable is in the effort to develop an affordable electric vehicle that people would actually want to buy, he actually shifted the production outlook of the entire industry. There's some really remarkable reactions that have been created out of Tesla's offerings, and specifically, as you can see on the screen, the introduction of the Tesla Model 3 has really changed an enormous amount of the automotive sector's outlook. Bringing a truly affordable entry-level luxury sedan that has the greatly improved cost of operation to market has really forced all the major manufacturers to reevaluate their thought process and timeline of bringing electrified platforms to market. So we'll touch on that in just a bit more. But as you can see, the numbers from the sales for the first 9 months of 2019, and then especially narrowing that down to the last quarter, their deliveries are ramping phenomenally, and their ability to scale is really, it's been pretty impressive. Now, all that being said, I want to make very clear, I am not the raging Tesla fanboy. I am all for the competition. It's just very important to point out that it's very unlikely that we would be seeing this major transition in the transportation sector if it had not been for Tesla's introduction of affordable platforms that could really compete with the major manufacturers' offerings. So that really kind of goes to this portion of it. So the interesting thing about the U.S. market and the penetration of EVs to date is that though Tesla's had some interesting offerings, and of course there are some other legacy players, the Nissan Leaf, the Chevy Bolt, a few of the other products that have been online, these were really mostly market experiments for the larger manufacturers, but that dominant presence and the phenomenal competition that the Model 3 has presented to major manufacturers has forced them off center to the point where now in the year 2020, we're going to see an enormous number of new offerings from major manufacturers. And over the next 24 to 36 months, the offerings we're going to see from domestic manufacturers as well as international manufacturers, both from Europe and Asia, are really going to grow phenomenally. There is an enormous recognition that fuel cost, ongoing operations and maintenance cost, the elimination of emissions from the vehicle. I know there's a large contingent of people who would push back on the electric vehicle sector, saying, okay, well that is, well, those electric vehicles are actually powered by coal. Where is the real emission savings here? What I would say to that is the greening of the grid is happening organically. The dominance of wind and solar in the new capacity construction over the last 4 or 5 years is, for everyone in the sector, nothing new. But that pushback or FUD towards saying, okay, well, these electric vehicles aren't actually all that clean or good for the environment. The mix of energy resources in the grid itself is just by the very nature of the price competition of renewables is already transitioning over to a much cleaner supply. So it's actually a profound effect to layer in the zero-emission vehicles with the greening of the grid, we really truly can make a profound impact on air quality. And what I would say also is for markets like California, where the air quality is, the worst in the nation in some of the major cities, there's the dominant contributor to NOx and SOx in those markets is vehicle emissions. So what is very interesting is as these vehicles get released and introduced into these markets, there's actually a very local benefit to air quality that goes beyond just reducing the larger emission spectrum for the country. The impact is truly realized there in the local market, which is interesting. So this looks out towards what the future holds, because going back to those previous slides and looking at the number of vehicles that are out and what's been moving through the market, we are really just scratching the surface. What I would point out very specifically, and I think this is going to be the thing that really surprises a lot of people, is for the passenger vehicle market, adoption is happening now and it's starting to become very visible. I think people would recognize it. What's less visible to most people, if they're not on the municipal operating side or if they are not in a fleet management perspective, is that one of the larger and faster upticks in adoption is really going to occur in the medium to light duty, all the way up to the Class 8 heavy transport vehicles. Speaking recently with one of the development leaders with a local manufacturer here in Texas, the Peterbilt group up in North Texas at their manufacturing facility, and there's some examples of their work later on in the slide deck. One of the most interesting aspects that I heard from him was that they're realizing a cost and operation savings of $100 per 200 miles. When you apply a metric like that to things like buses, which people don't usually think about the way you would operate a bus, it is one of the most emission-intensive platforms in the market. You have a large vehicle. It does up to 1,000 miles a day. It is all continuous stop and start. To create that sort of cost savings and also eliminate the emissions from a platform like that, again, truly impacts the air quality in a very near-term way in these local markets as they adopt. And so that really speaks to the fleet by segment approach, which I think a lot of people would be surprised to see, that we're almost at 20% of the domestic bus fleet currently. So just something to keep in mind is that this is actually an enormous opportunity for municipalities and fleet operators to realize these cost savings while also bringing that local benefit to their local areas. Now, that being said, then you look out to when will be, what would be the tipping point? When do we reach this mass adoption? What actually qualifies as mass adoption? And what is going to really bring that about? As you can see, there's the 2040 expectation that the vehicle sales will be 50% plus on the electric vehicle side, and the penetration will reach roughly 30% of the global fleet. Now, the interesting thing about that is if you go back and look at the most recent, and this is Bloomberg New Energy Finance data from just about a month and a half ago. If you go back and look at 2018's projections, you will actually see that they were lower than this. And if you go back to 2017, you'll see that they were lower than this. These projections are continually being revised and moved up year over year because adoption is really becoming is really accelerating. And I think there's a predisposition for, taking a conservative look when they look forward, and I actually completely stand by that. I highly recommend not overpromising and underdelivering. But this is an interesting, just looking at the current expectations, there's already a phenomenal growth in the market, especially if you consider, which we will also touch on here next, the infrastructure demand that will be required to provide and support the energy necessary to mobilize this sort of market penetration. So moving forward specifically to the Texas market, and please feel free to utilize the link at the bottom. This is a consistently updating dashboard where you can see both by vehicle type and by region, area, city, county, down to zip code. There are some very, very interesting tools that are out there and available for both the developer side and the interesting from the developer side, but also from the grid operator side. So there's some really powerful tools that are going to, I think, aid greatly in both the local, councils of governments, local municipalities, to both analyze what their market penetration is looking like currently, to look at, how they get ahead of the curve and what sort of infrastructure considerations that they're going to need to be a part of, because, like I said, there's going to be an enormous amount of rulemaking and policy that's going to need to be developed to help facilitate this in an intelligent way. So moving forward, this is the current stats, again, with the link below to the tools, to the resources for this. This actually comes out of a sheet that has the entire country's state-by-state penetration. But you can see clearly that you have, adoption rates of triple digits plus year over year. Like there's phenomenal growth in the sector, though it represents a small portion of the fleet currently. This is sort of like that experiment I think we all undertook in elementary school, where your teacher asks you if you'd rather have $1 million today or $1 today, and it doubles tomorrow, and it doubles tomorrow. And, as we all learned from that experiment, the redoubling per unit of measure for time is a phenomenal growth rate that really builds upon itself. And once the inertia starts, obviously it takes on a life of its own. Give me a moment. Let me double check my questions, make sure we're, yes, absolutely. So, all right. So we've got some questions coming in. We will touch on the questions towards the end of the presentation. So on the overview of the Texas market, this is pulling from the Alternative Fuels Data Center, which is a service built into the Department of Energy. Mostly what you will see in the public space is going to be the two different charging systems that you'll find on the right of those three. There is level 1 was the standard residential platform, but as you can see, at 2 to 5 miles per hour of charge, that is you're going to be challenged unless you have a very limited commute to really get into being able to charge your vehicles for ongoing operation at any kind of meaningful travel distance radius. But the level 2 and the DC fast charging platforms that are taking hold, they are much better at alleviating that charge time concern and build a much better network for really mobilizing the fleet as it gets out on the road, and people are using these vehicles to both serve as their personal vehicles, but also if they are using them for long-range operations. And then, of course, something that's probably not terribly surprising is as you see the clusters of charging all focus in the major population hubs, there is need for charging infrastructure to go out into the larger transportation corridors, because obviously you would need the ability to hit these in a sequence. But there are tools currently and usually embedded in almost every vehicle that's sold currently, as far as on the passenger vehicle side, that helps you if you were going to plan a trip from Houston to El Paso. That would help you identify all the charging opportunities along your route, and ensure that you were making it to each milestone with enough fuel to make it to the next location. So as I mentioned earlier, the electrified buses, waste management, and service trucks sector is a very interesting part of this evolution. We will be seeing a great deal of this because of the cost savings aspect for the operations maintenance, that the penetration for this layer of the transportation sector is going to be very interesting. But that is not to say that is just a simple, okay, well, now the doors are open and everything and everyone can switch over to this, and there will be, there's no issues created. There is absolutely the need for charging infrastructure, especially as you go to these larger platforms that are going to be covering much greater distances. You really do build a much larger system that needs to be recognized. So this that touches on the infrastructure side. So there's some very interesting points about the type of demand that's going to be created by the implementation of a charging network, even at local operator facilities. They're not even looking to the distributed truck stop, say, version of charging infrastructure for large and heavy fleet vehicles going out the road. And one of our major purposes within the e-mobility working committee is really to engage and begin the conversation with utilities, grid operators, various entities, that to help them think through what modifications they're going to need to their system, what behavior patterns they might want to address with their consumer side. But there are best practices that have currently already eliminated some really interesting approaches that help mitigate a lot of that risk and certainly a lot of that conflict that could potentially come up. And so that's going to be one of our critical aspects, is both engaging the grid operators and the local utility service providers to help educate them on the growth of the market, what it means to their system, how their system operates, and the things that they can do to get in front of the issues that might create for them. That being said, I know there's probably a number of grid operator or utility service providers on the call today. One of the profound points that was revealed to me along the way was that potentially electric vehicles and their mass adoption really represent one of the largest revenue creating opportunities and new revenue streams for the utility sector since the invention of air conditioning. I mean, this is going to be a profound volume of kilowatt hours that are going to go into into this sector, and they're now going to be the point of delivery aside from the current fuel system infrastructure. So that does show that there needs to be a thoughtful approach, and that is one of the things that we need to look at. I will say we are very proud to have one of the most forward-looking grid operators right here in Texas, in North Texas, Encore. David Trickler, who is head of their EV integration group, has been getting far out front of these, some of these issues, and thinking through what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, what the potential demand could look like. Because just specifically in Encore's territory, as you can see in the little excerpt on the side, coming into DFW and along the I-35 and I-45 corridors right there in North Texas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, 13% of all the freight traffic in the United States occurs. So there's an enormous amount of heavy transport that if you're going to look forward to transitioning that portion, or any reasonable percentage of that fleet to an electrified system, you need to be preparing today for the system issues that you're going to have in 5 to 10 years. So it's an interesting. It is very comforting, and I've spoken with David and his team at a few different events and on a couple of occasions, and it's a really amazing transition, and the preparation is going to be vastly important. The way we prepare for this is going to dictate whether or not it is a success, or whether it creates issues that can really hinder adoption moving forward. And then the excerpt on the bottom right, you see that you talk about which utilities, what sort of what their expectations are, and you can see how lopsided this, well, not lopsided, but you can see how dramatically split this is, where these utility service operators are some, the majority of this entire spectrum thinks that they're going to see, hardly any change or penetration. And I think that's really where the danger lies, is if the system isn't prepared, and if the system operators don't realize what's coming down the pike, then when it does get here, the need for infrastructure development or the reinforcing of the grid to be able to deliver the amount of power demand that's going to be there is going to be both expensive and painful. So it's really getting the consensus and building the coalition of stakeholders to get an intelligent roadmap that enables everything to happen in the most efficient, effective way possible. And I'm very happy to see thought leaders like David at Encore out there championing the cause. This is one of the tools that I mentioned for. This is more for the municipal side, for people that are managing a municipal service territory. This is the output of the Department of Energy's alternative fuel source, their Evi Pro tool. And what I did was I just went in and under 2 minutes, you pick your territory. You can dial it into city. You can dial it into a state. What I did was I ran just a model for the state of Texas, and modeled it for 1 million vehicles, which is actually a remarkably small portion of the total fleet for the state of Texas. And it really shows you, okay, well, here's what we see being needed as publicly available. Here's what, people are going to need to put. So what this does is this illuminates the need for, do you create a rebate or an incentive program for workplace development and deployment of these level 2 chargers to help people be able to charge while they're at work. One of the big concerns from grid operators is the fact that if just left to the status quo and it's all charging is done at night, what you wind up doing is as people leave their jobs at 4 p.m., 5 p.m. in the afternoon and head back to their homes, that is already when we have the spikes in demand on the network in ERCOT, MISO, all the service territories covering in the state of Texas. That's when you see your big surge. If you get a large penetration of EV charging and everyone comes home and plugs in immediately, that's not going to help that situation. That will exacerbate these price spikes. So, educating consumers, modifying behaviors, engaging facilities owners and operators so that they have the ability to install infrastructure on a distributed level where that demand can be shifted across the whole spectrum of the day, and how to encourage the deployment of that infrastructure. These tools are very handy, and please see the link at the bottom for anyone who is interested in utilizing those resources. I tried to make sure that all the tools and resources I touched on in this presentation were all included. Now, the going back to one of the points that I was making on the previous slide, in David Trickler's presentation that he made in New Orleans earlier this year, I believe. Yes, I believe it was earlier this year, talking about how the power demand, just one fleet operator in the North Texas DFW airport area went to Encore and asked them to say, okay, what would it look like if we converted our fleet? It was a 325 unit fleet that was identified and had approached them. And just with that one facility looking to transition a fleet, they were looking at an increase in demand for that facility on the system from a 0.5 megawatt demand to a 40 megawatt demand. So that creates, obviously, if you think about that, then spreading that out to the number of facilities around there, there's an enormous amount of power infrastructure that is going to be needed to support that. Now, the other side is that on the consumer side, the consumers really need to understand how they want to address what that's going to look like on their electric service side, because demand charges, as we all know, for anybody who operates a large facility, the demand multipliers that you create for your kilowatt hours can have an enormous effect, can be up to 50% or more of your total billing. So there's a very serious evaluation and preparation that needs to be undertaken to really manage this intelligently. And then, of course, as you move through the penetration or the evolution of a technology platform, what could possibly go wrong? So then, there are entrenched resources that are the traditional resources who have no interest in losing this market share to the electric sector. They groups like ALEC and other groups have gone in and really advocated at the legislator level to create policies or legislate where there's some pretty amazing penalties. Unfortunately for us, as you can see in the map on the lower right-hand side, Texas has fallen into that trap and is essentially contemplating some of the largest punitive policies in the country. And specifically to speak to that for just 1 second, the policy that ALEC recommended, and then what's not included under the headline from the Houston paper there, the Houston Chronicle, there was a $200 fee that was in the policy that ALEC was recommending and subsequently has been adopted by Pennsylvania and Missouri. And I'm not mistaken, I think Texas is looking at implementing it as part of that structure as well. It is the distributing out the responsibility for the ongoing roads and maintenance that is covered by a fuel tax, and then implementing this $200 charge. Well, the analytics have been done on this, and the appropriate charge, since of course there will not be a gasoline fuel tax that's paid by any electric vehicle driver, the proportionate amount that they would need to pay as part of a registration fee, or however that was going to be recaptured in lieu of the fuel tax, was closer to $70. So clearly these are policies designed to discourage, deter, diffuse the inertia towards moving to an electrified system, and that's merely one of those challenges. I would say to anyone on the call who doubts that this is significant, you can never underestimate the efforts that will be put in via large industrial and legacy resource players to defer people from adopting a different technology. It's their entire livelihood at stake. They're risking losing an enormous amount of the downstream business in delivering fuels. It represents an enormous risk to their business model, and they will fight back tooth and nail. They'll put everything in the world into it. Not to go too far down that path, the amount of money that's gone into climate change denial from different fossil fuel resource groups is enormous. They will lobby against it, and they will not slow down or stop for anyone. But among the other challenges that could potentially be on the road is, as you can see in the chart on the left, the pricing is dropping for lithium-ion batteries consistently, and projecting with the scaling of the market, and both on the stationary storage side and also on the fuel side, the projected costs are looking at going down and breaking the considered magical $100 per kilowatt hour as a purchase price around year 2025, 2026. Now, what this does, as these production lines scale, you also show this enormous increase in demand for rare earth metals and critical materials, minerals that what does that mean as those supply chains scale to support this demand? What does this increase? What kind of risks does this create? And for some some are immediately apparent. You can look specifically to the Cobalt supply chain in particular is one that is already posing some issues, because as we all know and probably would expect, there is obviously a large environmental inclination that is driving EV adoption, and so that concern for ethical and sustainable supply chains is very relevant. Well, the vast majority of cobalt that comes out and is needed to support these battery sectors comes out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And as you can see from the metrics on the left, this is one of the most dangerous, corrupt, hostile environments that you can imagine. And at the exact same time, what isn't represented in this data is that, I forget off the top of my head what the exact percentage of mines in the DRC is, but there's a very large percentage of what is considered artisanal mines. And these artisanal mines, defying their namesake, these are essentially individuals very frequently, almost invariably, employing some version of child labor in extremely hazardous conditions, exposed to very hazardous materials. So there is real reason for concern. They're finding sustainable resource or sustainable supply chains with verifiable protections for all the people involved is going to be a necessary component to really making sure that this happens in a way that everyone can feel good about and doesn't become, the next issue that we have to address as a result of this technology evolution. So, sort of in summation, we really are very excited about the transition to e-mobility. We are firm believers that we need to mobilize the stakeholders that can really help foster an intelligent evolution. And we welcome input and feedback. We very much would like to reach out to this network if you know people that are in the sector or are involved in the PUC legislature, the various aspects of the parties that are going to be impacted and need to be involved to really facilitate an intelligent process. We would welcome that input and that feedback. We totally understand, going back to the traditional resources, that there are market players that have sincere concerns. We are not adverse to those concerns. We want to make sure that all the parties involved get a fair stake in this conversation, and we welcome all input. I'm one of the rare people that I welcome the challenge. Like, I understand that there's varying opinions, and that those opinions need to be respected and heard. So we welcome input and feedback. If anyone has recommendations for how and where or who would like to be involved, I would welcome them to direct those individuals to me as the chair. I will be following up with people as that information comes in. Currently, those requests, please send them to info@alternativeresourcegroup.com. And I will be addressing those as they come through. We will be having a membership portal through TREIA's website opening shortly. We just started the working committee about a month ago, so we're building these resources, and that's really where we are for now. I will also point out that TREIA is hosting the GridNext conference in the Dallas area to support our inauguration of our North Texas chapter, headed up by Mr. Scott Dethridge up in North Texas. That will be coming up on November 12th. We have a link to the event on the TREIA website under the events page, so please feel free to check that out if you are in the North Texas area around the 12th of next month. We would welcome you there. We will have an e-mobility panel that will be going on with some of the market players that we've talked about during the presentation, but we'll also have a number of other panels and discussion boards with other stakeholders from TREIA. So we very much welcome your input and feedback on that, and look forward to meeting a lot of you there. And now I guess we will transition over to the Q&A part. So let's
thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I'll go ahead and step in here. And so we do have several questions, but for everybody that's out there, we still have time if you want to submit any further questions. And some of the ones that we've had are as much questions as they are kind of statements, I guess, for you to respond to. So I'm going to go ahead and run through those, Michael, and just respond as you may think is warranted. The first one is, do you really think it's even remotely appropriate to say the word FUD, I guess it's fear, forget the other.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Yeah.
Right. In this presentation, and then the question observes or opines that you are fawning over Tesla, and then make some remarks about Mr. Musk. So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
So I'll go back to I was the utility scale development manager for Solar City. When Solar City actually left the state of Texas, and many of my projects fell by the wayside when that happened. I actually have no undue affection for the group as far as fawning over them. What I would specifically say is it is very, very widely been said that when the larger manufacturers got into the game, Tesla didn't stand a chance. And they were talking about Volkswagen, Mercedes, Jaguar, the leading luxury brands. Tesla Model 3 is outselling all the entry-level luxury cars. Mercedes C-Class, Audi A4s, there are two others. It is just dominating that market segment. That's not my affection for them. That's the data coming out of the sales numbers. As far as the CEO and his behaviors, I have no feedback on that. We could probably point to every sector and every major company and identify bad behavior on the part of executive staff, and I mean, really in response, honestly, if we're the fossil fuel sectors have pumped billions of dollars into anti-climate disinformation campaigns. I mean, lots of people have done lots of bad things. I am not an enormous drum beater for Tesla. My position strictly comes around the data of their market dominance is pretty clear, and that's not my opinion. That's borne out by the numbers.
So let's go ahead and move on. The next question is not really a question, more of a point for you to kind of respond to. A Tesla running on grid coal-sourced electricity emits less CO2. I'm having a little trouble reading this. I guess than 30% miles per gallon diesel. Whether that comparison wins on primary pollutants depends on how bad the coal plant or the internal combustion engine is. So I guess it's what does it achieve to have a big fleet of electric vehicles if coal is charging them?
Well, and to that, and I actually Matt Weldon, I know very well. Very intelligent member of the community, and I very much appreciate his feedback. One of my former board members from Solar Austin, and he's certainly correct. As our coal fleet has been retiring strictly due to organic market competition with pricing. It is not a we're in Texas. There's no emotional attachment to renewables. Like ERCOT sells the power that has the lowest price. That is exactly how the free market works, and it has been very effective at driving the adoption of new technologies. And to his point, on days when we have an enormous amount of sun in West Texas and the wind's blowing up in the Panhandle, the mix of resources on the grid is considerably cleaner and greener than it ever has traditionally been. And then beyond that, adoption of these technologies is really growing in the mix. So the power supply is getting cleaner and greener just organically. And but even then, to Matt's point, the point is if you're running on kilowatt hours, the amount of mileage you get per kilowatt hour still represents a smaller emission footprint than if you were building a portable liquid thermal fuel. So that's essentially, I guess, my response to a non-question.
Let me proceed on to the next one. We've got time for maybe 3 or 4. The next one is for passenger EV, Texas can look to California for a grid integration roadmap. But then the question for fleet vehicles, will Texas and Encore, and I guess the TDSPs, need to be innovation leaders?
I mean, that is absolutely true. Yes, we 100% have to enable the various grid operators and then utility service providers. We have to enable them with the best practices. And I go back to David Trickler. He has openly invited any system operators, local utility providers, munis co-ops. They are very open to sharing the tools that they have used to model market adoption scenarios. And I very much welcome them to refer to that Smart Energy Power Alliance report that I pulled some of David's information out of. In that document about how utilities can transition successfully, he openly welcomed any and all questions around program development and available tools, and it's really encouraging to see that sort of collaborative spirit, because that's really going to help us get to the most positive end game.
Got time for a couple more. I'm going to skip the next one because it's kind of complicated, and move on to how can we use renewable energy to charge electric vehicles in Texas?
Yes, indeed. So, the interesting thing in Texas is, of course, we're free market. So if you go into any of the deregulated areas, you have the ability to contract. To say, if you were a fleet operator, you have the ability to contract with, you could sign on a PPA and get a fixed, and actually, frankly, a phenomenally low cost kilowatt hour. You're still paying for your transmission and distribution costs that you have to incur to get it to your point of delivery. But it's there are ways for fleet operators to contract with renewable energy sources to, if that was a core part of your corporate social responsibility strategy, those options are out there. And I would encourage people to reach out to TREIA. Obviously, we can connect you with both. There are both wind and solar resources. We can help point you in the right direction to connect you with the people who can provide the power for you.
Okay, let's make this the last one. There's some other questions that we received. And so, Michael, if you have time, maybe if you could respond to those through an email or just a message back on the platform. Let's move to this as the last one. What is ERCOT or TRE, Texas Reliability Entity, doing at the market level in terms of planning for the accelerated grid demand?
So ERCOT does have its own internal committee that is looking to address this, and TRE is for sure inclined to, because obviously reliability is the critical aspect of the Texas grid. I mean, that is, I think that's the cornerstone of the success of the ERCOT market, is the fact that it has brought down costs, but still maintained the reliability standards that need to be addressed. They have working groups internally. They are actively participating in conversations, and we are actively engaging with them. And the good news is, I think we have the runway and the time to really organize all of those efforts and thoughts into a single comprehensive strategy. So they are active in the space, and they're a good collaborative partner, and essentially part of that coalition of stakeholders that is really pushing towards the most optimal outcome.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll point out also that the Public Utility Commission has a project right now to address electric vehicles. And unfortunately, I haven't been keeping up with that in great detail, but I do know that that's open, and would expect that either in the near term or maybe a little longer than that, the Commission will invigorate that project and take a look at these issues because, as you say, they're coming up and not going away. Michael, let me thank you, and let me thank everybody who was a participant in today's webinar. I think this was a really excellent presentation, and appreciate you again, Michael, through leading us through these important issues, and encourage everybody with an interest to get involved with your e-mobility committee. And also, as Michael mentioned, we are repeating. We're bringing again the Grid Next conference, but this time it's going to be in Dallas. Just in case anybody didn't jot that down, it's November the 12th. It is at the Bill Priest Institute for Economic Development. And all of this information is going to be, and is in fact, on the TREIA website. It's substantially similar to the Grid Next that we held earlier this year. One notable exception is that I'm not speaking again, so I would expect that that will draw far more attendance, far greater attendance as a consequence. Anyway, hope that everybody who's interested can check out the Grid Next conference up in Dallas this year. So let's close the webinar. Thanks for joining the program today. We hope this was useful to you and to your organization. Please click on the survey icon to share your thoughts with us about the presentation and the webinar. We really appreciate those results, and we use them to plan future programs. Just remind everybody we've been approved for continuing legal education for the attorneys out there, so make sure to claim your credit. Also remind everybody that a recording will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing. We'll provide a link by email, and we'll put that on the Husch Blackwell website, and TREIA will also have it on its website as well. Hopefully you can join us for our next webinar in November. We haven't set the dates yet, but we will put information about that in the upcoming TREIA newsletter. We'll also send out an invitation to our friends from Husch Blackwell. We expect that that's going to deal with community solar programs, so that should be of great interest as well. Okay, so that concludes the webinar. Thank you, everybody, and see you down the road.
Thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thanks.